Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 25 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Montreal Canadiens, in which the Sharks have won 4-0. Now, I was at this game here tonight, and I must say that I picked the incorrect game to go to, because while this was definitely a Sharks win, 4-0, quite solid, it wasn't necessarily the most entertaining game to watch. The Sharks scored 3 goals on a manned net, but they didn't actually have that many opportunities or even that much zone time in general, besides the multiple power plays that they had that they didn't actually score on. The Sharks at even strength were kind of not doing much of anything, and while they managed these 3 goals at even strength, those were essentially like 3 of the only chances they actually had throughout. Now, having said that, that's not to say that the Canadiens were super dominant here tonight, and Kakinen had to absolutely play the game of his career to be able to get this shutout victory for the Sharks. In fact, while the Canadiens played a lot of time in the Sharks zone, they honestly didn't really generate that many great chances. Most of the saves that Kakinen had to make were kind of on these odd man rush type of transition opportunities. Generally, while the Canadiens were passing it along the outside, they never necessarily found that good angle to take a shot on net. When they tried to go for those cross-ice passes, there were sticks in the way, both at even strength and on the penalty kill, and the Sharks showed a very solid defensive game. I imagine in the interviews that David Quinn is going to be giving after this game, when the inevitable question pops up of how they thought that this game went for themselves, he's going to give the very classic cliche of, well, it was a solid road win, because generally you could say was. I mean, it's a shutout victory. The Sharks didn't necessarily expend that much energy to do that, which is important because it was a long travel across, the continent to get here, and they have yet another game tomorrow against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Starting this one off in the first period, it was a bit of an awkward start to this game. A minute and a half in, we saw a rare wraparound goal scored by Matt Nieto about a minute and a half into this game. The Canadiens would challenge that goal for the offside, and while I did think this one would come back, it ends up being an inconclusive review, and as such, the goal ends up standing. So the Sharks get a power play for themselves, and then 2 minutes later, pretty much as soon as the power play expires, they get a second one. At that point, the Sharks are leading in shots 7-1 over Montreal, and then they remain at 7 shots for the rest of the first period and a few minutes of the second period as well. As the Canadiens bring it back, they get a couple power plays of their own, but no goal scoring to happen, and the Sharks would have a 1-0 lead heading into the second period. In that second period, it would appear that the Canadiens would score a goal, but it was Dadonov who ends up knocking Cicek into Kakinen. That knocks him over, and while the Canadiens do put the puck in the net, the referee rightly calls an interference penalty in this situation. As such, the goal is nullified, and the Sharks still have the 1-0 lead. It's yet another power play for the San Jose Sharks, but again, not necessarily doing much on that special team type of situation. As the second period wore on, the Sharks would get a couple of shots, but it was still mostly Montreal, and late in the second period, the Sharks would take a couple of penalties, including their second delay of game penalty of the game, and give the Canadiens about 50-second 5-on-3 to start the third period. But the Sharks kill that one off, and then immediately, just a couple moments later, managed to answer with a Tomas Hertl goal to make it 2-0, and then pretty soon after make it 3-0 off of a Logan Couture goal. The Sharks would then get a 5-on-3 for themselves, still not score on that, but then it was still enough time to kill off the clock. The Canadiens would have the zone time, but honestly wouldn't generate much, and eventually would pull the goaltender, still not generate that great of a chance, and Hertl would get his second of the game, the empty netter, to make it 4-0 San Jose. So was this the most exciting game? Not really. Was this the most dominant game? Not really. Was this a victory for the San Jose Sharks? Absolutely. You can't argue that one, and they played decently well enough defensively to kind of just shut down what the Canadiens could do. On to the players to talk about here. The first line of Hertl, Meyer, and LeBanc. Generally, none of these lines were particularly dominant here tonight. Like I mentioned, there weren't a lot of offensive zone shifts for any of these lines, but if there was one line that seemed to be rolling at least a bit, it was definitely this trio. I would say Hertl had a pretty decent game for himself. Meyer had a pretty decent game for himself. LeBanc also had a pretty decent game for himself. They set up a couple of chances. They generated the very few chances that the San Jose Sharks did indeed have. It was a nice little play, generally on the first Tomas Hertl goal. Cicek keeps it in, feeds to LeBanc. LeBanc, nice little shot pass over to Tomas Hertl, who tips it in. And so a solid game, I would say, for the first line. Not exactly at the level that we have seen in the past, but still quite good. On the second line, we had Barabanov, Couture, and Matt Nieto. I would say an improved game from them compared to the previous one against the Vancouver Canucks. I had specifically pointed out Barabanov for his weak defensive play in that game against the Vancouver Canucks. That was definitely an improvement. Generally, it was a pretty solid, structurally defensive game from the San Jose Sharks as a whole, and of course, Barabanov is a part of that. In fact, in the third period, Barabanov managed to sort of mess up a couple of plays near the Canadiens' blue line and almost got a breakaway twice in that third period. It never actually materialized, but still very good work there near the blue line to poke the puck off of that Canadiens player, or those Canadian players' sticks, and so generally a solid game for the second line. Now with the third line, I talked about in that Vancouver game how they were potentially the best line for the San Jose Sharks. Noah Gregor was like the best player in that first period, generally playing extremely solid. This was, I would say, a slight step back for them, found themselves in the defensive zone a lot. And I felt as though their defensive zone shifts, compared to pretty much every single other line's second defensive zone shifts, I guess besides the fourth line, were a bit weaker. They had slightly more issues killing or defending, I would say, but still some clutch blocks from players like Bonino, some decent plays from players like Cunnin. Gregor, not that great of a game, took definitely a step back from the previous one, but at the very least it wasn't an awful game here from this third line, which is saying something considering many of their games earlier on this season were indeed quite awful. Now when it comes to the fourth line, we did see a substitution. It was not Nico Sturm returning to the lineup, but instead Svechnikov steps out and Jeff Viel from the Barracuda steps in. So for those who were, if anyone had on their bingo card the fact that the next player to be called up from the Barracuda as a forward would be Jeff Viel, then I guess you win the grand prize, because I wasn't expecting it, but now that I think about it, I probably should have been expecting it just based on how this season has gone thus far. Viel comes in onto the fourth line with Lindblom and Lorentz, and it is pretty much a disaster. The only notable thing that this fourth line actually did was take 2 penalties, both in the offensive zone, one from Viel, one from Lindblom, and otherwise they were defending a decent amount. Even when they were in the offensive zone, they weren't doing much. We saw Lorentz end up in the offensive zone. He held the puck for a good while, 15 seconds or something, before eventually just losing it with no pass, no shot on net, anything of that nature. The fourth line was not good. Viel was not a good fill-in. I can't say he's necessarily worse than Svechnikov, who didn't really do anything in these past couple of games, but still, this is not really the solution that the Sharks were hoping for, and at this point it just seems to be a wait until Sturm comes back, and hopefully that helps out. On the defensive side of things, there wasn't really much offensively, and that obviously all points towards Erik Karlsson. He had a very good game against the Vancouver against the Vancouver Canucks, but definitely a bit more muted here tonight. Didn't really get to generate much, all of those amazing shifts that he had against Vancouver, going through the legs, making those plays, setting up Luke Cunnin. We didn't see a lot of that here tonight. On the other side of things, though, we did see some very solid defensive play. In particular, I will mention a couple of these players. Megna, I would say earlier on in this game, I noticed him a bit less later on, but for the first 20 to 30 minutes of this one, I thought Megna was very apparent and playing some very solid defensive hockey, challenging the Canadiens players, forcing them out, and even making a couple of decent pinches himself. I was also very impressed with the duo of Vlasic and Benning, which of course have become the defensive shutdown pairing for the San Jose Sharks when they are trying to keep the other team from scoring with their top lines. The Sharks send out Vlasic and Benning as a pairing, and I thought Benning looked very solid. I thought Vlasic also looked very solid here in his hometown, and generally a very strong game for that second pairing. On the third pairing as well, we had Cicek. I thought Cicek definitely had a better game. Pretty solid performance for himself. Šimek was okay, not amazing, but he was definitely serviceable, and generally it was, like I said, a solid structural defensive game for the San Jose Sharks. So while Karlsson did not shine offensively, the whole unit as a whole shined defensively. And then finally, when it comes to the goaltending, definitely nice to see this rebound game from Kähkönen. Like I mentioned earlier, he wasn't heavily challenged in this one. He certainly had a couple of nice saves on Caulfield and on Suzuki, but as a whole, it wasn't so many times where I was saying, well, thank God Kähkönen is in net, because otherwise the Sharks would be down 3 goals or something like that. By the end of the first period, it felt as though the game maybe could have been 1-1 if not for Kähkönen, but realistically not even that bad. So it was certainly a solid game, a strong rebound game for Kaapo Kähkönen, but I wouldn't go so far as to say, wow, what an amazing performance. He's back. He's going to be that starter for the San Jose Sharks. He certainly had it a bit easy in this one. In fact, I also thought the Canadiens themselves didn't, they kind of helped him out a bit with some of their shot placement and choices. Or lack thereof, I should mention, because it felt as though they were taking a lot of passes that they could have shot on. But that would do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action tomorrow, where they will take on the Toronto Maple Leafs. The Canadiens have been an okay team thus far this season, but of course the Maple Leafs are a step above them, as they usually are in the regular season at the very least. And so we'll see if the Sharks can hold that team off to just 0 goals. It'll definitely be more difficult at that. Class dismissed.